welcome to Books and Brews. I believe this is Books and Brews Light number 14. I am a little behind on uploading because I was out of town. I was actually in Nashville at the Southern Festival of Books, and we had a fantastic time with people from probably the age of 4 up to much older adults, trying on our medieval helmet and waving our medieval sword and striking poses and looking scary like an angry knight. So I am a little bit behind, but welcome Yvonne Caputo. And before we jump in, I would like to ask people who are watching to please like, share, and subscribe, leave a comment, help our channel grow, since we put a lot of work into promoting authors. That would really help us and help our authors, and hopefully help other people find great new books and great new drinks. Speaking of drinks, mine is probably kind of boring today because I was thinking, what goes with your book? And my first thought was, what goes with flying? Well, what do you get when you're flying? A Diet Coke or something, or an orange juice? I mean, or if you're in first class, you get wine. But when I read more about your book, it's really more about relationship and sitting and chatting with people. And it seemed like we sit and chat over coffee. So kind of boring, but what do you have?
Sit and chat over coffee.
Perfect. And I think you said that's your favorite drink too, right?
It is. It is.
So this is our guest today is Yvonne Caputo. And so I'm going to ask you, Yvonne, to introduce yourself and your book to our guests.
Okay. Well, I have 2 books. The one I'll be reading with is Flying with Dad. And then the second one is Dying with Dad. Mm-hmm. And in 2008, I was on the phone with my father, and he opened up and told me a story about World War II that was funny and off the wall and scary. Mm-hmm. And I'd never heard it before. Mm-hmm. So having conversations with Dad was often difficult for me, because once we got past dialysis treatments and doctor's appointments, we found it difficult to talk because I'm not a sports fan.
You're not a what?
A sports fan.
He's into sports then.
But I am a history fan. Mm-hmm. So on the very next call, I said to Dad, if you're willing, start at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And story after story after story came rolling off his tongue. And at some point, I was taking notes and I said, I've got a book. I'd never written before, but this stuff is really good. I've got a book.
Right.
So that's the first book. It's a compilation of Dad's stories, but it's also about how in the beginning, Dad and I are disconnected, then his stories in his own voice, and then how the writing of the book gave me the father I always wanted, and he got it better.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And at what age was he when all of this started happening?
85.
Wow. So it kind of took a lifetime to achieve.
It took a lifetime.
Okay.
Right.
The first thing I was curious about, the title is Flying with Dad. Did you ever actually go flying with your dad?
No, I didn't. But he did support my flying. And one of the
you fly?
No, I don't fly, but he supported me getting in a plane.
Okay.
And one of the stories in Flying with Dad is how he tricked me into getting into a single engine Piper Cub.
Did you have a fear of flying?
I still do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not a good flyer.
What happens? Do you just like have a panic attack, or what happens?
I do it, and if I'm totally honest, I've been told by pilots that I just need to take a course so that I understand the bumps and the turbulence and those kinds of things. I don't stay away from flying, but I'm just not as good at it, and I'm not as in love with it as my father was.
Okay. I was particularly curious because my dad did have a pilot's license. That wasn't his job in the Air Force, but he did used to take us up when I was like 4 and 5. He'd take us up in the little one engine, two engine planes, whatever they are. And he used to think it was funny. Do you remember the kind of U-shaped steering wheel or whatever it's called? He used to think it was funny to take his hands off the wheel and go, "You're in charge." And here I am, like 4 or 5. And so instead of realizing that doing this, I would panic and go, "I don't know how to fly."
Well, that thing that you were pulling on, the steering wheel, is called a yoke.
A yoke.
Y-O-K-E.
Okay.
And in this flight, in the single engine, the pilot said to me, "Okay, I'm going to give you the plane." And he said, "Push the yoke forward." So I did, and up we went. Pull the yoke back, and you go down. He said, "Now turn it." And we were, flying at an angle. So that's the closest I've ever been.
Okay. So were you taking an actual course on how to fly?
No.
Oh, you were just in the plane.
Yeah, my father somehow met this man, and he set it up so that I would meet him in a restaurant. I was a waitress. And then he set it up for the man to ask me for a date. And it ended up that he took me out flying.
Okay. So did you go on a second date?
No.
No.
I was not kind of intrigued. And I never realized until a long time later that all of this story about me getting in this plane was a setup from my father.
That's hilarious.
And it was wonderful, though. I mean, he said, when we're in the air, he said, "Can you tell where your house is?" And there was a big aqua blue water tower. And that was always the sign, because that was on our road. So he flew us out over that road. And my father and brother were down on the lawn. And then he flew in low enough that I could literally see Dad and my brother. And they were waving their hats in the air.
That is so neat.
It is.
And was he, I'm assuming he was trying to help you and hoping you would fall in love with flying.
I'm not really sure. And here's one of the things about missing him. That's a question I'd like to ask him.
Okay. Right. Not knowing. I found your story interesting. The little bit I read of it is it called Ingenium Press? Am I getting Ingenium? Okay. I wish they'd talked a little bit more about it, but we kind of have some similarities because my dad flew and my dad was in the Vietnam War. And so, not surprisingly, just like I think absolutely everybody I've ever talked to whose father was in a war, they do not talk about it. And in fact, if my mother had not told me, he was actually in Vietnam when I was born, so I didn't see him until I was 6 months old, kind of more like he didn't see me. I wasn't paying attention at 6 months old. But if my mother had not told me, I don't think I'd maybe even know now, except that one day we found a box of things that he had from Vietnam, including some cartoons he had copied of Snoopy saying "War is hell" sitting at the bar, which I think was an actual cartoon that he copied. But he did tell me the only story I recall hearing, I think my father-in-law asked him some questions. And the only story I recall ever hearing was at that time. And it was kind of funny, except not, it was about how their base, even though he was going weather in Saigon, and so he was relatively safe compared to the guys out there in the jungle. But for a time, they were getting bombed every single night. And so the story was about how, some of these poor nurses would be caught in the shower, trying to get their shower in and come flying out stark naked, And so the way he told it, he was telling it like, "Oh yeah, haha, you feel bad for the nurses," but that's the only thing I know of his time in Vietnam, other than, he brought us some things from there, but that's about it. So what got your dad, I mean, up until the point you said, start from the beginning, did you ever try and ask him questions?
He never talked about it, and I never thought. When he told me the story, and I don't know where the question came from. I just said, start at the beginning. He started in high school. He started
In high school?
No, he started the story graduating from high school.
Okay.
And then he went on, it was in the midst of the Depression, of getting training under one of Roosevelt's programs,
Mm-hmm.
and repairing airplanes through this training, and ending up repairing the airplanes that young learning pilots were, in Dad's words, busted up.
Okay.
Then one plane came in missing a wing, and there weren't any. It would be normal for Dad to call the depots. This is where planes were repaired.
Mm-hmm.
And say, do you have a wing? And a wing would be shipped to him, and he would attach it to the plane, and that's how it would happen. But there weren't any. So Dad asked for the blueprints. At 19 years of age, he built one. 17 and a half feet of a wing. Attached it to the plane. The pilot who was going to take it up for his first run came to Dad and said, is it going to fly? Dad said, yeah. You're sure it's going to fly? Uh-huh. You're positive it's going to fly? Yeah. Good, son, get in, because if it goes down, you're going down with it.
Oh my.
So Dad is sitting in this 2-seater training plane, and his exact words were to me, hon, I didn't want to fix him anymore. I wanted to fly him.
That's a neat story.
So it evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming that the stories in the beginning were easy. And by the time we got to his entrance into World War II and going overseas and going on bombing missions, he just learned how interested I was. He learned the lengths that I would go to research something when he said something that I didn't think was true or that I wanted more information about. So I think just the development of where we started and how we talked built into his ability to tell me the hard stuff.
Okay. What was your relationship like before? Was it kind of distant or aloof or just kind of shallow?
Exactly. He was greatest generation.
Mm-hmm.
There was a roof over our head. There was food on the table. He slept down the hall. He was there. But talk to me about the things that I thought were important.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was closer to my brothers because they went fishing and hunting with him.
Yep.
So my sense was he just didn't know what to do with a girl.
Okay.
And that's what I would have liked to have from him. So that's the first part. That's the beginning of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Through this, talking about the war and all the stories that came, the trust level really built between us.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of our time together, he was telling me about nightmares. He was telling me about flashbacks. I'm a psychotherapist, so I knew I was hearing about PTSD.
Right. And I'm assuming, I'm hoping that gave him a great deal of healing to be able to talk about it finally.
It did. The nightmare was the same. It happened for 3 years in a row when he came home. He never knew when it was going to hit him. The B-24 that he was a navigator on was hit and falling from the sky, and he couldn't get out. And in the dream, he's pulling at him, trying to get through this tunnel to reach the place where he could drop out of the plane and open his chute.
Mm-hmm.
He never got out in the dream, and he literally dug channels in the mattress.
Oh my.
Yeah, and the mattress had to be destroyed, and they got a new one. So as a psychotherapist, I could explain the neurobiology of nightmares. I could talk about why they happened. I could talk about when he left the war, they didn't know. And that our treatment of trauma had so advanced by the time he and I were talking about it. And sarcasm was a language that Dad and I developed. Okay. So at the end of this conversation, I said, sorry, pal, you're just normal. And your nightmares were normal. And I literally could sense my father's shoulders dropping.
Mm-hmm.
after we had finished that conversation. So there was healing.
Right. In the actual event, I assume that his plane really was shot down.
No, that never happened. But
Oh,
what
interesting.
he did witness was he witnessed other planes going down.
Okay.
And when he saw that for the first time, when another plane ahead of him was hit by flak,
Mm-hmm.
that's incendiary bombs that are exploding at 22,000 feet, and
Mm-hmm.
watched that plane go down, he peed himself. And
Yeah.
he was in an electric suit. It short circuited.
Oh my.
And in World War II, there was no pressurized cabin. It was
Mm-hmm.
60 degrees below zero.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew as navigator that they were approaching the English Channel. And he got on the interphone and said to the pilot, when we hit the channel, bring this down to an altitude so I won't freeze to death.
Oh my gosh, that is quite a story. Now, you call this an electric suit?
Yes, it was it plugged in somewhere on the plane, and it
To
heated
keep him warm.
to keep him warm.
Okay. That's something I didn't know existed. You know, it's funny. I know a fair amount about World War II, but I had never actually heard of that.
Well, so many of the stories were things that were unique that
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't know, that were funny and quirky. And that's really what pushed me to write the book, because here was
Mm-hmm.
an ordinary guy. It wasn't D-Day. It wasn't the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't Eisenhower. It wasn't any of those kind of things. It was just extraordinary, ordinary stories.
Right. Well, and I think those are important to tell because, well, even now, you know, how long have we been at war? And I think we need to talk about these things and the fact that we keep sending young men off to more and more war. And what's it doing to them? What's it doing to those left behind? You know, it's affecting their marriages, it's affecting their children, it's affecting our whole society. So,
Dad would get angry at the drop of a hat.
mhm.
And I never understood why. But after doing this and listening to him, I did. He came back and he said to me, he said, Yvonne, I walked up and down the streets. I saw guys that were in the war. They seemed to be okay. They never talked about it. So I thought it was me.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about, again, what we've discovered about war and what it does, you know, to people
Right.
who are directly involved in it.
And I think that your book gets a little bit, or maybe a lot, into how do we help people heal from trauma, specifically war, but maybe more generally?
It was more specific to Dad.
Okay.
It was explaining to him what the nightmares meant and
Mm-hmm.
why we didn't know it. And Dad also had a flashback. And here again, I was able to explain to him why seeing a German jet in a museum, he dropped. He lost consciousness. So
Mm-hmm.
when we're triggered, fight, flight, freeze, or play dead. Dad
Yep.
played dead when he saw that German plane.
Wow.
So when he woke up, his friend said to him, well, what happened, Mike? And Dad said, I don't know. And when he told me the story, I said, Dad, tell me about the German plane. And his words were, oh, honey, it was so fast. It was nimble. It could get over us. It could get under us. We were flying in these tight formations where we couldn't bob and weave and get out of its way. We were sitting ducks.
Mm-hmm.
So when he saw that plane, his brain kicked in to that memory. Now, he didn't have a visual memory of it, but it was so fast that freeze or play dead is how
Mm-hmm.
his brain reacted.
Did these things ever leave him even after he started opening up and talking to you about it? Or does it end up being, to an extent, something that people are just going to live with?
It's both and.
Okay.
It's both and. I think over the years, the distance from it helped to soften it.
Mhm.
But also the incident of him losing consciousness around the German plane, it happened probably 50 years after he came home.
I believe that, young people do not understand this. By young, I mean, I don't know, 10, 15, 20. To them, 70, 80 looks so old. It looks so far down the road, but you get there, and my 20s seem like yesterday. My even being 10 or 12 seems so close.
Mhm.
And so I easily believe that 50 years doesn't necessarily diminish it. So what is the biggest thing that you hope people will get from your book?
From that book, that you can build relationships with folks, with parents or people who are distant. Now, as a therapist, I need to say there are some parental-children relationships that are toxic. And I've had clients who have needed to divorce from those relationships. But if that's not the case, and it wasn't in mine,
Right.
my curiosity about Dad, my asking him open-ended questions, my ability to listen and to listen deeply were what created this bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And
Do
that's
you work primarily with people on parental issues, or specifically parents who have trauma, or is that just one part of your practice?
I'm a generalist. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology. The people that I tend to see are folks that I feel comfortable around their issue: depression, anxiety, trauma, relationships, and death and dying,
Okay.
and grieving.
Mm-hmm.
If other people who call me have a different issue, I will say things like, I'm going to recommend that you see somebody specifically about this. This is not something that I'm good at.
Okay.
It would be like you having a heart issue and me being just a general practitioner.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the way I dealt with it or deal with it.
Did I don't know if issues is the right word, but did your experiences with your dad impact your decision to go into psychology at all?
My decision to go into psychology was going into therapy for myself.
Okay.
And part of that was my relationship with Dad. Part of that was my relationship with my mother. And I will say to your audience, they did the best that they could do, given the resources that they had.
I think that is very key. I think there are a lot of people who have traumas, lesser traumas, greater traumas from childhood, and it can be hard to forgive. But if you remember, they're doing okay. Some parents aren't doing the best they can, but a lot of parents fail their kids, but it's because of their own past and the ways they were failed, and they just don't have the tools to work with. And I think understanding that helps you to forgive and move on in life.
And part of that, too, for somebody in therapy is, okay, so this is where you came from. And it's important to understand all those dynamics and what they did to you. But now as an adult, you have a choice. How do you want to move forward? How do you want to live your life from now on? Understanding where and how you came from.
Exactly. And living in anger is, it's not going to make your life any better. It's not going to make your parents change. It's not going to undo the past. So, I've been there. So, do you have a reading prepared?
I do. Okay, so to set this up, okay, I had just been to see my dad in my hometown, 6.5 hours away. We had come home. All right. So here we go. Back home in Pennsburg, the phone rang on the evening of New Year's Day. We had been home just over 24 hours. When I picked up the phone, Dad started yelling. Why the hell did you tell them I could go home? I pulled the receiver a few inches from my ear to protect my eardrums. I'm in agony. The damned hospital sent me home with no pain pills. It was his back. He couldn't sit, stand, or lie down. All he wanted to do was sleep, which he couldn't do. I'm scared, Yvonne. Dad had lowered his voice. I don't want to be alone. Can you take a leave of absence from work? That's when I knew how serious this was. Of course, Dad. I'll leave tomorrow morning as early as I can. When we got off the phone, I'll find someone to come and stay with you until I get there. I'll also call the hospital so we can see about getting you some medication. I took a deep breath to steady myself, and I said as clearly and as firmly as I could muster, "This is it, Dad. You can't live at home any longer. When I get there, we will have to go to Plan B." He agreed and then ended the conversation with, "Honey, I'm so sorry I yelled at you. I didn't mean it." I was used to his gruff ways, and sadly, I was used to him yelling. I was not used to receiving an apology from him for his yelling.
What do you think inspired him to finally apologize? Was he like in his 80s at that point?
He was 87.
Okay.
And yes, I think that was it. But I also think that it was how far we had come.
Mm-hmm.
His kind of self-awareness of who he is or who he was and how he responded to things, but also his awareness of who I was.
Right. So I'm thinking then that maybe as he felt like he knew you more, maybe he started to have a little more empathy for how these things felt to you.
Exactly. So go back a day or two. We're in the hospital. I'm ready to leave to drive back home. And I gave him his Christmas present, which was the first draft of the book.
Oh, nice.
And I said to him, "I just want you to know how proud I am of you." And he said, "What the hell for?" And I said, "For your service during the war." He said to me, "No, honey, I'm proud of you. You wrote the book."
That's really nice.
That's where we had come to.
Okay. And obviously a vast difference. And you have a second book,
Yes.
Dying with Dad, and that stemmed from the first, correct?
Yes. People who read Flying with Dad wanted to know, when my father's passing came, how I could have let him go if he could have been saved. I arrived home. We had to call EMTs. I had to call the hospital to get his do not resuscitate order. The doctor in the emergency room called the EMTs and said, "You can stop working on him." I did that because that's what Dad wanted. He and I had done legal paperwork called an advance directive. We had done something even more special called the 5 wishes. And I went into automatic drive because he didn't want to be saved. And the EMT said, "This is not looking good." So to bring my dad back into a vegetative state or somewhere where he didn't have quality of life, I wasn't going to do it.
Right. And I think that became a real ethical issue as technology and medical care kept advancing. And all of a sudden, you can keep someone alive. I think it's a good question, though. Do they want to be kept alive to lay in a bed, paralyzed and unable to talk or communicate with anyone? And, I'm not a huge, I don't believe at all in withholding food and water. One of the stories that came out of World War II, are you familiar with Maximilian Kolbe?
No.
He was a Catholic. I believe he was a monk, not a priest, but either way, he was put in a concentration camp and somebody escaped. And what they would do every time someone escaped was take 10 men, throw them in a room with no food and water. And the first kind of miracle was that one man was begging, I have wife and children, don't take me, don't take me. And Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward and said, let me go in his place. So the first miracle was that the Nazis actually let him and let the other guy go, which they never did. But the second miracle, and the reason I bring this up is because I was told in a college class on biomedical ethics that dying by starvation and dehydration is a peaceful, happy way to go. I happen to already know the story of Maximilian Kolbe. And I know it's not, because they said every time they threw these people in this room to die by dehydration, there were screams of agony up till the end. But what was miraculous about Maximilian Kolbe was they were singing up to the end, and he was the very last one to die. And so that's why I would never say, starve and dehydrate someone, but stopping medical care, I've known people who have faced that, and eventually somebody is in so much pain and misery. Why are you going to keep subjecting them to painful procedures that really aren't going to make their life any better anyway? And, we're born to die. We're all going to. So.
And Dad's words to me were, when we were working on these documents, particularly the 5 wishes, was, hun, if I don't have 75% quality of life from what I have now, please let me go.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I went into automatic pilot because Dad gave me the gift of trusting him, or trusting me, rather. And I was going to give him the gift of following his request.
And it sounds like obviously you're very happy with that. So
actually, thank you, because that's a lead-in question, because here's what my passion is for the second book. My grief journey with my dad is totally different. Because do I miss him? Sure. Do I cry sometimes out of the blue? He's been gone 14 years. Absolutely. However, right alongside that sorrow is a profound, sacred joy.
Yep.
And how many of us get to, when we lose someone like that, do we get to experience joy? Well, I do.
Yep.
And people who've read Dying with Dad have had some very unique responses to it to let me know that the message has come through.
That's wonderful. So it's a book that's helping people both before and after someone they love passes.
Yeah.
So what is next for you? Will you be doing another book, or is this kind of the 2 that you feel you were born to write?
I have another one in mind. I'm sort of kind of working on it. But how far I'll get and whether it's completed, I just kind of let that be. It'll grow if it's meant to grow. It won't grow if it's not meant to grow.
Okay. So where can people find you online?
They can find me by my name, Yvonne Caputo. They can find me on ingeniumbooks.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. And my email address is Yvonne, all lowercase, author 4. That's all together. Yvonne, author 4 @gmail.com.
Wonderful. So I can be found at lauravosica.com, booksandbrews.net, and our sponsor, Gabriel's Horn, can be found at gabrielshornpress.com. I would just like to highlight the newest book, Cooking with Rabbit, and this is recipes with rabbit meat. Surprise! Kind of self-explanatory. And we just got a shipment of some new books. This isn't new, but the books shipped are new. Gypsy Heart, which is Hungarian poetry translated into English from a Hungarian immigrant to this country. So that's a fascinating one historically to me. A Dream of Dragons, which is a fantasy novel about a young woman washed up on the beach who is having dreams of golden dragons, but they turn darker and darker. And finally, this is one of the newer books. It's called A Woman of Many Names. And this is a book that was very specifically like yours, written to help people. It's the story of a woman who, as a young woman, was told, by her boyfriend, she thought it was her boyfriend, we're going to run off to Spain and have a great life and, get away from your awful parents, blah, blah, blah. Turned out his intention was to turn her into a prostitute and make some money off her. And so it's the story of how she finally got away from him and got back to a better life and came to terms with all that had happened to her and the guilt and shame she felt. So I think it's a wonderful book. And she does travel around talking about this and helping young women. So I think it's a great book. And I am also at all the social media, Instagram, Twitter. I'm pretty easy to find because there aren't that many Laura Vosicas in this world. There is one other, but it's pretty obvious which one is me. So thank you for being our guest on Books and Brews. Cheers.
Cheers.